Someone once asked me a question about being alone in the studio. The reality is that I'm never alone in the studio. I mean, I do have assistants, but when they're not there, I'm still not alone in the studio. I'm there with the work. So there's a dialogue, there's an interaction, a communication, a constant discussion between me and the work. It's about absorbing experience and then experience melding into expression. One of the things that I'm thinking about is how this sculpture is going to have a lot of layers of reference and meaning, so that someone coming to the sculpture without a history of looking at art can be drawn in and have a connection to it.
Howard's forms are forms that emerge out of his deep understanding of many, many cultures around the world and the sense that objects can evoke a tremendous set of associations. They are simple forms, but as you begin to study them and consider them, you realize how complex they are. They're very well considered forms.
When you see Howard's pieces together, I feel that you'd like to even imagine a form of life in which you could live among those things. It does transcend its material. It transcends the fact that it's glass while at the same time keeping the properties of glass as part of its meaning. The work shows what its meaning must be. I thought how interesting that was so far as sculpting in glass is concerned, because it's such an unusual material.
This material has its own kind of life, has its own kind of fluidity and aliveness. That's the quality which Howard cooperates with and uses and furthers in the kind of way that he addresses that material.
I think on that level, he's someone who has used the medium, used it to its utmost, found ways to make it be shaped and formed and created in terms that he was comfortable with artistically.
The way the glass captures the light is what transforms this sometimes almost literal symbol. When I first started working with glass and I looked into that furnace and there was this roar, and I think that was one of the attractions, was how to take the energy in there out and put it in my mold.
Howard Ben Tré's sculptures have their birth in a two-dimensional form.
I realized that drawing was the most important step between my outward sense and my inner sense.
It is in the beginning of that imagining through a gesture on paper that Howard first creates the sculptures that he does.
My drawing process starts very gesturally in a sketchbook. When I come to the big drawing board, in order to make something, we have to move from that intuition to a real line. So my drawing lines are then refined to get the exact line. And everything else then is erased around it till I get exactly what I want. The way I draw is only important for me because it helps me understand what I want to create. I never think about how we're going to make what I'm drawing. I always am drawing quite freely. I never really think about how we're going to make this. From that real scale drawing, the patterns are made, the shapes are made. The pattern is the sculpture. However, instead of being made out of glass or bronze or granite, it's made out of rigid polystyrene insulation board that's laminated together and carved. After the drawings are done, Eric comes and takes tracings of them and makes templates. And then he comes in and shapes the block. So this really started out as just a big block of styrofoam. After it's really rasped and looking tight and right, then we come in and just coat it to kind of smooth out the surface, and it's much easier to get a sense of what the finished piece is going to look like. Once we have the patterns, we make steel containers. And the steel containers are used to hold not just the patterns, but they're also used to hold the mold material. Then we take those molds and we transport them to the glass factory. When I go to the factories, first of all, I know process. So right away, I get a certain amount of respect. That's my background. My dad was a carpenter, and I worked in different kinds of factories, and I did construction work. And my first job when I was 14 years old was in a machine shop after high school, running a drill press.
Howard's quite proud, I think, of his background. He knows a lot about how you do things in a place like that, so he has that authority because he knows his way around the material and he knows his way around the tools.
The fact is, I do something very unique with the material that they work with every day. And after just a short time, everybody at the factory is drawn in to what we're doing. And they're seeing the material used in a totally different way.
The industrial aspect is something which not only accomplishes the work, but contributes to the meaning of the work, which also sets his work apart.
The thing about casting the glass is that it doesn't take very long, but you have months of work at stake. So it's incredibly intense. And things can go wrong all the way. We're working with molds that weigh somewhere between 750 and 5,000 pounds. We're putting into those molds somewhere between 200, 300, 400, and 2,000 pounds of glass. You really want to get the glass into the mold as quickly as possible. The longer it takes, the more likelihood there is of temperature gradients developing within the glass. And as the temperature gradients develop, stresses develop. The second issue is you don't really want it all that hot, because the hotter the glass, the more likelihood you're going to get fusion between the surface of the glass and the sand mold. So all those things are happening very quickly. And then we're lifting those molds with the glass up and placing it in a cooling oven that's at 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. When the molds are placed in the cooling ovens, which are top loaders, you open these ovens, all that heat comes straight up, and you've got to be there on the edge. The glass cools for 2 to 2.5 months. And then we go and take it out of the sand molds, which is really quite a bit like archaeology. You cast these things in the sand, and then you actually are shoveling the sand out of the way, and you're looking for this object embedded in the sand. After we take the pieces out of the sand, we bring them back to my studio, and really that's when the work begins. because after they come out of the sand, they go through sandblasting, cutting, grinding, all kinds of other processes which take this raw casting and turn it into the sculpture. So when the pieces come back to the studio, they really get heavily worked.
Glass, today, is primarily thought of in terms of craft, and craft is mostly thought of in terms of objects that can fit on a table.
I think that Howard's work stands outside those conventional expectations of glass.
It both is about glass, but utterly transcends glass. And yet, at the same time, one very quickly forgets it. You really wouldn't know necessarily and instantaneously that the medium is glass, because we often associate glass with transparency.
He brings out really interesting properties of glass.
Howard Ben Tré's work holds a very particular position within a material that is indeed not commonplace. It may be commonplace in our lives, but it's not commonplace in our lives of fine art and sculpture. So he doesn't play according to conventional rules in that way, but he also doesn't in the forms and in the impetus, I believe, that is of his work. And so in that use of casting for the kind of meaning and quality which it can bring, we have really no other artists that we can compare.
When I first came to Providence, Rhode Island, I saw around me the remnants, the detritus of the Industrial Revolution. I realized how similar the proportions were in these mechanical and industrial artifacts as they were in the ancient architecture that I had been interested in for so long and had studied. And I started working on a group of sculptures called cast forms, which looked very mechanical or industrial, and yet also at the same time could be small models for architecture. I left them very rough. They were really the first larger castings that I attempted. And then the next family became architectural elements and really literally looked like parts of architecture. I wanted to have this aspect of all the sculptures that they could be complete in what they were, but yet they implied that they were part of a larger universe. What happened in making the columns, which were not really abstract, I mean, they were pretty literal. They had a lot of references, a lot of layering of meaning. Well, they became very figurative. The columns, the architectural pieces, moved from being about holding something up to holding something. In the dedicants, I introduced lead. There are these lead bars, carved elements, which are not affixed to the glass, they actually are held in there. The lead was covered with gold leaf, and the gold leaf implies a great value. And yet the gold was covering lead, which in our culture has little value. They set up a dialogue about perceived value and real value. The figurative work really came about as a natural transition. These figures started holding things, that within the figures there started to be areas which were enclosed within the sculpture, sacred. They were kind of like you couldn't get to them. The figures became less about being figures and more about what the figures had to hold within them. At a certain point in the development of the figures, the figure became a container. And so I drew up a family of work which became the vessels of light. In fact, they reference sometimes laboratory ware, sometimes perfume bottles, but always there are areas within them which seem to be the area that could hold something, but in fact open up to the outside. We think of vessels as being something that we hold in our hand, and yet these are totally out of scale in that sense. And so when you come to them, they have a kind of figurative presence because they're on your scale. When you look at them, you realize that they're curved on their bottom. To describe that part of the circle, the technical term would be a section. An idea of taking essentially a two-dimensional section, turning it into a three-dimensional sculpture, and creating a space within that element. It was a way of making sculptures which were connected to the earth. Architectural elements were taken from Japanese temples and then carved, hollowed out to be filled with water and used within the tea ceremony. That was very intriguing to me. Another interest is implements, the first tools that were made by people. We see these implements as describing a culture that we don't know. Dug up objects which become more than just a utilitarian object. They become an object of ritual value within the culture. The primary vessels really became a melding of several groups of work I had done before. They encompassed the idea of the figures because of the way they held these cavities or shapes. They also referenced the vessels of light in that I turned these forms or shapes into vessels by creating openings where you would perceive the form as potentially being a vessel. The next group of work, the paired and wrapped forms, I polished surfaces on many of them. So it created not a polished surface in the way you might think of a piece of Steuben crystal, but a kind of semi-polished surface, one where you sense the outside form first, and then you can start to see into the piece. And then they're wrapped. I was very interested in the idea of wrapping, whether it be a reference to Hindu wrapping or African wrapping, or I grew up in a very Orthodox family, and that my grandfather used to daven, and he would use these leather straps to wrap points on his body during this process of prayer. And I did this group of lingams, which were wrapped, and then sometimes paired. Because I do so much drawing and always have, I started a group of works on paper based on the original drawings, which utilized copper leaf, which I patinaed, so it sort of described the glass. And then I used these black gouaches to prescribe the negative spaces within the sculptures. Now the works on paper have become these really three-dimensional, flat objects. I build up surfaces, I create a thickness to them, I use handmade paper on the surface to create texture. I use so many different kind of pigments to color them, silver leaf, gold leaf, copper leaf, lead, charcoal. One of the things that I really like about doing them is that I don't ever have an assistant involved in them at all. So they really give me a kind of very immediate feedback. The vessel has been used historically as a fertility symbol in a lot of different cultures. So I drew up this group of sculptures, which then I called bearing figures. The reference is to the fact that the figure, which is made either out of bronze or granite, is holding, bearing the vessel. And that within the vessel, there is this other form, this seed, this soul, this center. I made the figurative elements frontally wide, but from a side view, very narrow. And yet the vessel maintains the integrity of a 360-degree image. So it's actually sort of piercing the figure. It has a tremendous amount of presence because when you first look at it, the vessel seems flat. And yet as you move around the figure, the vessel becomes this fully three-dimensional sculpture. We are not always what we appear. Sculptures that you can sit on. They're about creating a kind of contemplative aspect to stopping, to sitting, to waiting. I want people to sit on them and touch them. We're very trained by the museum world not to touch the sculptures. To me, this is a really fabulous opportunity to break that barrier down. Because I started doing sculptures that you could sit on, I was able to broaden my relationship to public art. My interest in having my work be in the public realm, has always been there. I mean, there seemed to be no reason why I wouldn't be interested in having that happen.
The progression of Howard Ben Tré's work from studio to gallery to public spaces is a progression out of opportunity and possibility.
I've been making proposals really from the beginning and continued to make them.
It allows his work to be accessible to people who might not choose to go to museums or who might not have the opportunity to get into the private collections where so many of his most beautiful works can be seen, but are only seen by a very select number of people. These are objects which are going to be available to people all the time in public places to be seen any time of day. I think that really is very exciting for Howard. He's not a person who necessarily wants his art only to be seen by a certain type of person. And I think he's also someone whose art can be equally interesting to someone who's never looked at a work of art before, who didn't realize they were even looking at a work of art.
The North Plaza is a meeting place. It's a place where people come.
So you go there and you look at it and you hear the water and you see the glistening drops and you feel the freshness, and it's inevitable that other people there feel the same thing. And so it gives you a natural basis for a community.
It's really allowed me to take my sculptures and create a context for them.
He uses sound and textures, and the totality of that experience of sound and sight becomes the experience which we have. And it's in that transformation of space that I think we also have very often that transcendent experience.
When I have the opportunity to work in a public context, which is happening more and more, I try to take that magic, which happens in the privacy of my studio, and have it flow into the public realm. To me, the public projects are an extension of my own interest as a sculptor, as an artist.
And I know that it's his aim in some way to use his art to create a sense of a community.
Howard's very lucky also to have a fantastic personal and professional partner in his wife, Gay, whose presence is crucial to any success that Howard's had.
Gay and I have been together for 30 years. Several years ago, after our son reached a certain age, it seemed really appropriate to work closer together. Gay's involved integrally with all of the public projects.
I tend to define my role in our partnership as predominantly being a facilitator. Something I bring to the table, which is really valuable, is my sensitivity to details.
When we come to a meeting, we come as the studio of Howard Ben Tré, and Gay is part of that studio.
Bank Boston Plaza in Providence is like a kind of theater space to me because it is itself a sort of proscenium stage, a place to observe others, a theater.
The bank came to me to create a fountain at one end of the plaza as it already existed. And I suggested to them that I would create a concept for the plaza, that we should change the entire plaza. And from there, I developed the concept scheme for how the plaza should look. So in fact, my role from the beginning was to actually create all the plaza elements. The first thing was to divide up the space, then to conceptually unite the space, and that was done through the use of materials and the forms.
The beauty of this place is that you can come in and you can have a solitary experience or you can have a small group experience. I think you can be soothed and calmed or maybe reflect on something that's coming up or something that's already happened. To me, that's the best possible use of a public space, where you can go in and be yourself and make a choice about how you're going to interact with the space.
Howard understands not simply making an object, but situating an object, watching how that object becomes part of a public space, realizing that a bench is as important as a sculpture, realizing that the plantings can be as crucial to the aesthetic success of that site as the seeming signature object that might be at the core of it. So I think it's really allowed Howard to move out into a public realm in a way that bespeaks an extraordinary capacity to be multifaceted.
I don't think Howard's really had the recognition he merits. He's redefining sculpture. These objects create a kind of pleasure we don't usually associate with art. And certainly there's a lot of power in Howard's work.
I think Howard is someone who has many decades of art ahead of him. He now has the professional acclaim so that he'll really be able to do many of the things that he wants to do, that it really will be a choice for him of what he wants to do as opposed to whether he's going to be able to do it. I'm very optimistic about the kinds of public projects, for instance, that Howard will be able to create in the coming decades and the ways that they are going to transform the cities in which they're located.
They might serve as examples for what's really possible for this sculptor, who I see more as a sculptor of space than solely a sculptor of objects.
I always see myself as making sculptures. And I always see myself as making sculptures that have glass in them someplace. But I also see myself as trying to find a greater and greater context for how making sculpture can be an everyday experience for people. Currently, I'm working on a series of major public projects. I'm working on a really unique project in Havana, Cuba, with the urban planners there on a 10-block long street scheme and park, and under construction. I have a really fabulous project in Warrington, England, where I've been responsible, along with Gay's collaboration, for the pedestrianization scheme of 2 500-foot-long streets and the town center. Warrington is a very old industrial city in the northwest, halfway between Liverpool and Manchester. And because of it being a market town, the traffic went through the center of Warrington, and that continued until present day. They have brought me in to create the concept scheme for how to bring pedestrians back to the town center and to bring to Warrington a continuation of its history as a place where people would journey to. The Warrington Town scheme starts at the center at Market Gate. The Well of Light is a 20-foot diameter granite and glass fountain. Surrounding the Well of Light are 10 12-foot high sculptures. And then running up the center of these different streets, we created these different garden areas and places for people to walk and to rest. Within the center of those walking zones are places to sit and enjoy a more communal experience. You know, it's really hard to know where that will lead me, but I'm really pretty young. So I have a few years. I have a bunch of time left to make things.